Baikie. I'll be your facilitator for the workshop. And my background is technical, like quite a few other people here. I have 30 years in the ICT industry, starting out actually in power industry, electric and gas. Moved into software development, and then I spent 17 years with the company Sun Microsystems, and mainly working with the mobile phone industry. Spent a lot of time in both Southeast Asia and Africa, helping the first mobile operators get up and running in those places. The last 6 years, I've had a career focus change, so to speak, and doing more projects that have a humanitarian approach using ICT, mainly in Africa and the Caribbean, Haiti. However, there's a gentleman that approached me at a conference in Hawaii 7 years ago and said, "We need help in the Pacific Islands. Why aren't you coming here?" And that gentleman was from Micronesia. And so after that initial conversation, it took a good 7 years to pull the project together and making sure they're ready there, and all the pieces were in place. And so last year, started working in Micronesia on a project there. So I've been also wanting to do additional projects in the Pacific, and just received an award for a project in Vila. I did come to Vanuatu last November to look at what could be done here in education and in broadband networks, and so continuing these conversations to see what role I can play there. As far as the background, a lot of these projects in the last 6 years relied on funding from different funding sources. In the case of the project in Chuuk, funding from corporates like Google, as well as foundations such as ISIF, Pacific Telecommunication Council, IEEE Foundation, to name a few, Internet Society. And as Sylvia and I were talking, we talked about how do you become successful with grants, how do you, to make these projects actually happen so you can do the technical ICT things, you need funding, and funding that's properly aligned to the project. And so we talked about, well, how do we make an impact with getting good funding for Pacific Island projects, which led to our conversation about putting this workshop together and who should attend and how to pull the pieces together. So it's not a technical workshop for those that just, so you know, it's really to talk about how do you put the right messaging, the right budgeting together for a realistic proposal to a grant agency that will win. And the good news is once you figure out that success formula, then you can take that idea that you have, the proper way that it should be funded, and then there's multiple funders that would be excited to do that. So while we're focused here on ISIF, I think once you do a successful grant with them and the ideas and concepts that you pull together, there's other granting agencies like the Internet Society or corporations, as well as foundations like IEEE that are very interested in good, well thought out projects that make a meaningful impact. And our challenge is how do we get those thoughts from our head down on paper, and so that we can put that meaningful grant in place so that we can do these kind of projects. One question a lot of people ask me is, why did I shift from, I'll say, corporate ICT into this sector? And it was kind of interesting. It was about 8 years ago. The CEO of the phone company out of Rwanda was visiting California, and he came to our corporate headquarters, and we had just launched a line of eco servers. And his #1 expense in Rwanda running the phone company was power. And so he was trying to figure out how can I reduce my power consumption, and as we just launched this line of eco servers, he came to figure out what those were all about. But he made a very passionate speech about how he was trying to drive internet to the universities, because he saw it was critical, how he was trying to drive internet to the secondary schools. But in his conversation, he didn't say anything about primary schools. And at the coffee break, I asked him, well, what about primary schools? Don't they deserve this? And he said, well, all the primary schools in Rwanda, 99% of them don't have electricity. Without electricity, you can't do anything. And so the engineer in me, my background in power, said, well, that doesn't make sense. There's, why can't we build more efficient ICT equipment, Wi-Fi equipment that can be solar powered and get the cost down and start putting these kind of technologies in places that aren't on the power grid. And so we don't need to rely on things like diesel or gasoline generators that rely on imported fuels and pollution factor. So it spurred the engineer in me to solve that problem. So I thought, oh great, I'll solve the energy problem with this. And as I got into it, that was like 1% of the whole problem with implementing these projects. Coming at it with my engineering blinders on, I learned a lot with the first projects. In fact, some of the first ones I did were in Senegal. And it was just interesting learning that, it isn't just about the technology. You get that 100% right, but if you haven't built local capacity, so there's long-term sustainability. If you haven't got the local partners on board to actually want to use what you've brought to them, as well as politically that everyone in a village, for example, understands what's going on and they all accept it and want to participate. And so taking the technical blinders off, there's a lot more to it than that. And a lot of the part of being successful in writing a grant isn't just about the technical aspect. It's actually more about how are you going to build that local capacity? How are you going to take this idea for this technical thing and how is it going to help the local population? How are you going to integrate that in with the local culture, as well as who's going to be there long term to sustain it and maintain it and keep it going so that you see the benefits of this idea that you have. I know that we all have good, especially this side of the table, very good technical ideas, but how do we translate that now into a bigger picture? So, a big part of grant writing is having an initial idea. We're going to talk about that today. But it's also about putting that blueprint together on, okay, here's the idea, but how are we actually going to implement it? How are we going to actually make sure from a community level locally that it's going to work and the right people are bought in and there's people that want to maintain and support it long term. So, well, that's a little long introduction how I got here from Vanuatu today. My home base is in San Francisco. I live in Berkeley, California, but now I work for a company called Inveneo, and Inveneo does these type of projects around the globe. And so my travel schedule, for example, for this year, I've been twice to Ethiopia, to Haiti, to Micronesia, Hawaii once in January. So, and next month I'll be back in Micronesia. So, and then to Vila. So, trying to get more work in the Pacific for myself personally, just because I actually enjoy the people here, as well as once an idea takes hold in a community, they want it to succeed. So for me, working on projects, that's a good feeling. So as we look at grant proposal development, I think one of the problems that a lot of people have is they see, oh, we've got to come up with what's the problem, what are the goals of what we're trying to do for this grant, what are the objectives, writing narratives, putting timelines in place, budgets, evaluation, and how we're going to report on it, and executive summaries, and they see this as a very daunting task. And I know as a technologist, it's like, well, I've got this idea what to do, but none of these other things have to do with technology. And so it becomes overwhelming. I think what we can do is if we break this down and look at segments of it, it becomes very manageable. Because once we come up with that good idea, the rest of these things will fall into place. So, let's kind of start out with the basics. What is a grant? A grant is a conditional gift or a conveyance of funds with strings attached. And what that means is a granting agency has an idea of something they want to change in the world. And what they're looking for is ways to get that done or new ideas to promote that. But they really don't know the idea or outcome of how to achieve what they want. For example, if we look at what the conditions on the ISIF grant, one thing they're looking at, innovative access technology and implementation. So how to, innovative ways to get broadband and internet connection to places that have poor connection or no connection at all. Another thing that is one of their conditions is they want to look at ideas that do coding for good, for example, on mobile phones. That may help in the education or healthcare area, but coding or applications on that platform that aid society. And then the last place is internet rights and applying those internet rights to a society and ideas around that and how to make those improvements. So if we look at any grant, there are strings attached, meaning they have specific things that they're trying to achieve with their funding. And we always need to look at, is our idea going to help with the things that are driving that grantors and what they're trying to do, what they're trying to achieve. But the key here is the idea originates with you. And what the granting agency is looking for you is you've got an idea different than someone else may have had for your community, for an island, for a society, and now does that idea fit within the conditions of the grant? And if it does, then how that's a good thing. And how do we move forward? So just to review, a grant is a conditional gift or conveyance of funds, but there's strings attached, meaning the granting agency has their requirements of what they want and how they want to see that money spent. But they're just an identifier. They've looked at in areas that they have interest, but they're not sure how to pull those pieces together. So once again, they're looking for us, you, to have ideas on how to solve problems within the areas that they have interest. So, a lot of people I talk to, they've got good ideas and they're like, well, I don't have any money to do it. Well, have you applied for a grant? And they said, well, no, I haven't. Well, why? Well, I may not get it. And it's really funny, the number of people that I talk to, they're just afraid of rejection, that they may apply and not get the grant. Well, or their idea is not good enough. And a lot of people say, well, I've got this idea, it's not good enough, but I don't know how to get funding or there's no money for it. Well, in talking to granting agencies, what's interesting is they actually only 1 in 5 proposals that they receive are turned down because it's a bad idea. Most of the time they haven't followed the conditions of the grant. They haven't followed the rules of submission, or they've missed the deadline, or they've missed a critical piece of information. It isn't that their idea isn't good, they haven't articulated or supplied the information needed to the grantee to be successful. However, a rejected grant proposal is actually worth a lot. If you were to hire someone to review your grant and make sure you meet all the requirements and the idea for that grantee, they're going to charge you around $10,000 to do that. But if you submit a grant on your own, it gets rejected, you've got immediate review, and most granting agencies will tell you why your grant wasn't successful. So you can view that as, you're getting free advice on how to improve that. And if you have been rejected, don't fear, because the success rate for proposals turned in a second time is quite high. And those that have been rejected a second then apply for a third time and continue to fine-tune their idea the grant, making sure they meet all the requirements, is almost a one-to-one. That they, by the third time, they usually understand what the grantor wants. They understand the rules of the process, and they're actually successful. So don't be afraid not to apply. You may not get it the first time, but it's a learning process. We're learning as we go on, and we can go through the next round and become more successful as we submit these grants. So you talked about innovation. You led right into my next slide. So how do you succeed? Well, the grantees are looking, the granting agencies are looking for innovation and creativity. And they're looking for new solutions to old problems. But as we just talked about, where does that creativity come from? And it doesn't always have to come from technology. We have to think a little bit out of the box from the standpoint of, okay, we can have the fastest computer that uses the lowest amount of power, but if we don't have somebody locally that can support it, it's not going to last for long. So once again, the innovation may be coming up with a local skills training to improve local employment in the ICT sector so that the project is successful. It also, as I said, maybe from the funding or the way we implement the project. So how do you create creativity? In these type of projects, it comes from a lot of different levels and a lot of different areas. The other important piece on how to succeed in getting grants is also with talking to the program officer, talking and calling Sylvia and asking her, here's what I'm trying to do, does this make sense? I don't quite understand how this applies from a monitoring or reporting. I want to make sure I'm clear on that before I submit my proposal. And if we look at all the submittees that apply for grants, statistically 85% have had a contact with the granting officer and have had a conversation to clear up what's the right procedure, what's the timeline, that's deadline. Is my idea something that meets the criteria of the granting organization? Or it doesn't seem to appear, but is there a creative way to look at it so that it does fit in with the requirements of the granting organization? So, two critical factors when looking at applying are not only the technology piece of it, but looking at, are there other places I can be creative in the funding, in the implementation, in the local capacity building. The second is making sure that you're talking with the granting officer, the program officer, so that they can, that you can have that discussion and understand. And looking at statistically, the majority of those people that do that end up being successful in winning that grant. The last thing you want to do is apply for grants blindly. Just hope that you're going to be successful. I think if you have that dialogue and you know who you are and what you're trying to do, it increases your success rate dramatically in winning the grants. And so what I'd like to add to that, as we look at how we be innovative and creative, as Sylvia has said, there's lots of good ideas. Now, how do we articulate that for our own situation? And part of that is also taking that idea and formulating it on, for example, how ISIF sees a successful grant and talking, for example, with Sylvia about your submission and what you're trying to do. And as we mentioned earlier, innovation comes from many places. Well, as she said, they're all good ideas. They can only fund a certain number of those. Well, what she's looking for then is innovation in other areas. Have you been creative in innovating on bringing another funding, matching funding from another organization that can help to achieve your goals? Have you looked at the other areas of local capacity building, or how you're going to actually roll the project out in its time frame, and who you've recruited locally to help support that? So while there's lots of good ideas out there, as I mentioned, people aren't failing because they don't have good ideas. It's pulling all of that together and articulating it in their grant proposal. So, once again, the two key takeaways from here are looking at other areas besides just the technology where you can be creative. And second, making sure you whatever organization you're requesting the grant from, that you talk to the granting officer. There's a grant that I just recently worked on that, I broke my own rule and didn't talk to the granting agency, and they turned it down because part of their rules was they didn't fund travel. And, the grant was set up for a group to go in and help in a local environment, but they didn't fund travel. And that was one of their stipulations. Well, I wasn't successful in that grant. But that was my own fault for not talking to the granting officer saying, here's what we're trying to do. And they would immediately say, well, we don't cover those kind of expenses, and I wouldn't have, wasted my time, or I would have been creative to figure a different way or find another agency that may have funded that and to make the project successful. So once again, the key here is be creative, not just in the technology, but on all other aspects of your request. So, how to get started? Well, the granting process is a journey, and while coming up with that good ideas and promoting that good idea is easy to rally around, submitting a grant is really about putting a blueprint together and covering all the areas. So, we have this good idea that we want to do. What do we do next? Well, does it fit within your own organization or structure or community of what you're trying to do? Is there enough local support that will help with that? If that's the case, the next step is really pulling the team together. And I think this is a place where a lot of people try to do grants and grant writing on their own when they really need to look at who else can they pull in to help. As we're all technologists, well, this side of the room mainly, it's easy for us to dive into the technology piece. And as being technologists, we don't always articulate well all the other pieces of the project. And so what we need to do is actually pull in other specialists or people with experience in different areas to help formulate and pull those grants together. I know from my personal standpoint, I was approaching a lot of my projects and requests for grants purely on its technical basis and not being very successful. And they all kept coming back and saying, where's the human factor? Where's the social science? How are you going to monitor and evaluate? And in my case, personally, I was in Hawaii at the Pacific Telecommunication Council giving a presentation, and one of the panelists I was sitting next to was Professor Laura Hosman, and from Illinois Institute of Technology, and her talk was completely different than mine, which was totally the humans factor, how you do monitoring and evaluation. And I looked at her and I said, you're exactly what I've been missing in being successful in getting funding. And so we teamed together as a team, taking ideas from a technology standpoint that I had, taking ideas from a budgeting standpoint, and then looking at her innovative ways on how she does her ideas on local capacity building, how do you do evaluation and monitoring from a social science standpoint, and making these projects successful, not just from the technology standpoint. So, my success rate personally for submitting and receiving grants went from about 20% to 95%. Because I found the right team member to team with that could help go through that grant process and make it successful. The next step then is really, match the idea to the grant. And I talked about that earlier. Every grant has strings attached. It has what their idea is on how they want their funding to be spent, what they want it to be spent on, the area of their specialty focus. And in the case of ISIF, of course, it is innovative access technology and approaches for broadband and internet. It is coding for good on mobile platforms. and it's internet rights and openness policies and ideas. And so what we need to make sure is that our grant idea matches the grantee's requirements. And so this just takes the team to take a look at what they're looking for. Do we fit? Is there an area of interest? And this is the first point where you may want to talk to the granting officer to see how your idea fits within what they're funding, what they're thinking for this next year's cycle of funding. And then once again, read the guidelines. I think I've talked to both the grantors and the grantees that have been successful and those that have failed. The biggest issue is following the guidelines of what's required for the submission. As Sylvia says, there's lots of good ideas, but it's those that do a good job following the guidelines and articulating from how they're going to implement the project, how they're going to handle local cultural and human capacity building issues, as well as realistic budget. Those are the ones that become successful. And I can't emphasize more, reread those guidelines again. Because I've seen too many people that have waited, for example, the day before and try to pull all this information together to have a successful grant, and they're not. And then they're rejected, and they give up. And what we're trying to do here is plan this out, understand when it's due, what's truly needed is the effort to put into this, but pulling that team together so that it's just not all on one person's shoulders to get it done. And come up with all those creative ideas, not just in the technical area, but the implementation, the budget area, and the local capacity building. And once again, contacting the sponsor, the granting organization, to truly understand how your idea is going to fit in, how your approach is going to fit into what they're trying to do. And then plan in detail. And it's really then taking that idea and then matching that to the requirements of the grant, from how are your objectives, how are you going to do the implementation, breaking that idea down. And once we have that idea and how it fits into the grantor's expectations, those details actually become quite easy then to articulate and to capture. And then the other big area is developing a realistic budget from that detailed plan put together. And I would say the ability to articulate the idea and how the grantor sees what they want to be done is the #1 area. The second really is having a realistic budget. And how much with the budget money that's available can you realistically do? And we've seen it from both sides where they haven't done enough for that budget amount, or they've gone in with $1 million idea, but the grant's only $30,000. And there's a big mismatch there. How are they going to launch their own satellite and get internet connectivity to an island when the grant's only $30,000? It's not realistic. It's great that you want to put internet connectivity on that remote island. It's great that you want to improve the life there, but you're not going to launch a satellite and provide that connectivity for $30,000. The idea and the dollar amount just don't match. So developing that detailed budget and a detailed plan around the budget is going to be critical. And this afternoon we'll spend time really doing that. And once again, read the guidelines again. And the narrative that you have in mind to talk about how you're going to meet those guidelines. But, don't give up if you aren't successful the first time. As I said, a lot of people are, the first step is actually applying. You don't know if you're going to be successful until you apply. If you don't make it the first time, be persistent, revise that, and then resubmit. And just from my own personal background, where I was having a 20% success rate, I see, now looking back at how awful those submissions I made were, because they were so technically focused and didn't really cover the human factor or how it's going to integrate with local culture or the innovations and building new capacity. But once I put the right team together, address those areas, that success rate went from 20% to 95%. And the mistakes that I see in my own grant request today are, I can go back to this chart and say, guess what? I didn't read the guidelines very well. I didn't reread them. I missed an important factor, and that's why I didn't get that grant. So if you follow this chart and the steps in this chart, I think this will give you a good path to be successful in the grant process. I keep talking about this thing as the idea, and the key with this is, of course, how do we get that idea from your head, that's existing in your mind of what you want to do, and turn that into something that's presentable for a fundable proposal. And so, the key is, taking that idea and identifying the specific needs or problem associated with it. There's a lot of good technical ideas out there, but for most grants, they're looking for a bigger picture. How is that technology or innovation that you thought of actually going to apply to that specific community, to that specific island? How is it going to benefit the local population? How are you going to build human capacity so that it's sustainable? It's just not a one-time thing that happens. So it's you've got that idea in your mind, but it's really then how do we turn that into an idea that's fundable? And how do we put the package around it that covers all the areas that the grantor is looking for? And so, from a step process, we really need to take that idea, look at what the granting organization is looking for, and then identify how that idea is going to support a specific problem, or what's needed to associate that idea with that problem for a solution. And what I mean by this is, like an idea, I want to put a computer lab in a school, or a rural school, and in some of the grants, even the early ones I wrote, was all about technically how I was going to do that. I'm going to address the power need. I'm going to address, the software that's going on the computers. I'm going to look at the hardware and select the right computers so that they, will last longer in a humid, high salt air content region. And, it was all about the technical aspects. And what it was lacking is, well, guess what? If it's going into a school, shouldn't we train the teachers? Shouldn't we find someone locally that we can, they can learn how the computer lab was built, how the solar system's working, so that they can maintain it locally. So what we have to do is look at a bigger picture of how that technology is going into a specific location and the package that goes all around it to make it successful. Not just the technology and the hardware itself. You want to say something, Sylvia?
Just wanted to share a couple of examples on how those crazy things sometimes happen. Long time ago, when I started my career, we developed the first telecenters program in Latin America 20 years ago. And it was just a small computer center run by women in 3 very poor areas in Bogotá and Colombia. And then the Colombian government was trying to work on universal access and how to use the funds of the international phone calls to feed into the technical infrastructure of the country. And they reached out to the Swedish to find out who was doing cool stuff on community access, and the Swedish come back to them and say, this is small telecenters project in Bogotá is actually very interesting, why don't you visit them? And they were 10 blocks away from us, but they didn't know us. So that's one thing about networking and how sometimes ideas just kind of travel around. And then they say, okay, we want to do what you're doing at a national level. So how many computers you need, how many cables you need, how much money you need to build this, what is the best access strategy to have this. And we come up with a ridiculous figure compared to the Colombian budget. It was like the whole health budget of the country was supposed to be invested in this universal access strategy, and it was only on the technical side of things. But when we try to explain to them that you actually have to train the teachers, you have to identify who is the champion that is going to carry this, the torch of providing access and training people on how to back then use the mouse while you're not watching the mouse but watching the screen and things like that. The numbers for the budget on how to match the technical needs and the human aspect of things were more than double. So sometimes it's that human aspect that is not included in the proposals, and when a jury or a minister or someone else look at it, says this is not viable. There is no way you will be able to do this, even if you have all the cables and all the technology and all the servers and everything else. So that's sometimes it's just to be realistic again on what are the human limitations of people, that things happen, to allow for bad things to happen and to allow for change to happen into the proposal. So you can't plan it to the last minute, to the last detail, because there are things that are going to happen and you have to allow that to be part of the proposal to show that you actually understand the context you are working with. So I think it's what Bruce is saying about trying to put your idea into paper and make it into action. It's not only taking into consideration what is needed at the technical level, but the human aspect, the side of things, and in some cases, the readiness of people to actually accept that idea and engage in that. Sometimes you have to spend a lot more money into having these kinds of conversations with community leaders to try to align them to be part of a proposal. And that might sound kind of, why I've been doing this, is too much money or too much time to invest on just getting up to know each other and learn to work together. But sometimes that is the key issue that will make the proposal sustain, or the project or the initiative sustainable along the way, even without funding from time to time. So it's never underestimate that the power to bring those ideas into life resides not only in the machines, but in the people on the other side.
So the key takeaway from this slide is really to take that idea that we have, and then how do we actually take it and look at what the funding agency wants and how we address the other things that go along with that idea. And I'll give you, let's just do a little sample of that. Everybody's excited about tablet computing now, and low-cost way to put computing in schools, for example. And there's, everybody looks at that and says, that's great, let's, they're affordable, we can hand them out, and won't that be great? And once again, but what's the package around that? And a lot of people focus on the technology or the hardware side of it, but how do we look at the rest of the picture? I'm working on a project right now where Google has donated 2,000 of these to go into schools in Haiti. This is the Google Nexus. And, then talking and pulling together, it's great that Google donated 2,000 of those, but now the hard work has begun because, what do you do, how are we going to design a power system that we can recharge these every day? And these, recharge at 5.5 volts through a USB connection. Well, I can't buy a solar system that outputs, to 200 of these at the same time. So now here's another technical challenge. But the part that really is hitting the heart is actually the applications, because the Minister of Education there says, oh, well, we have an ICT curriculum you don't need to worry about that. Well, their ICT curriculum, the first 4 weeks of their curriculum is about how to use a keyboard. Well, these don't have keyboards. The next 14 weeks is about how to use Microsoft Word with a keyboard. Well, there's no Microsoft Word here or a keyboard. So, so as, this grant is being put forth to fund the deployment of tablets, there's a lot of, the applications, the human capacity, who's going to be trained to support these locally. Well, it's a great idea. We're going to give tablets to school children in Haiti. And isn't it great that, 2,000 kids will get this? Yeah, that is great. But how are these going to be recharged every day? What's the curriculum that they're going to be taught with? How are they going to be secured in the evenings? And as we start thinking through all of that, we can see from a grant process the thought that has to go into that grant process. How are we going to train the teachers? What management software is going to be on these tablets to aid the teachers in the tablet deployment? So once again, it's a great idea in someone's head. Let's give 2,000 of these away, and won't that be great for school children in Haiti? Well, our task is really now, how do we make that into a funded proposal that we've thought about all the elements that go around that we can identify, okay, here's the idea, but what are the problems or the specific things we need to associate around that idea to make it a fundable proposal that when the funding agency looks at it, they say, yes, they thought through all the issues. They thought through, well, we need a different set of applications. We need a different curriculum for tablets because it's a different technology than a desktop computer. We need a different kind of management control system because these originally were designed for one-on-one usage, and now, as we know, in most schools you have 4 or 5 kids per computer. Now, how is that going to work? So these are all the things that the granting agency is looking at. Have they really thought through how they're going to do this? Have they really thought through the cost associated with coming up with a new application set, a new training curriculum for teachers to have this new idea put into their schools? Jackson, does this make sense? So, my takeaway, from this slide is really, we all have those good ideas, and that are going to have a meaningful impact, but we need to really present that idea into a fundable proposal. We really need to take that idea and then build around all the supporting things that need to occur. Whether it's it's just not about the hardware technology. How is that going to operate? What are the applications that are going to run it? How are we going to support that, both from a technology standpoint and a human standpoint, to make it sustainable? And then the last part of that is the price. A lot of people focus on, oh great, look at somebody invented a $100 computer, won't that be great for school kids? Well, there's a lot more in that price than just the cost of the device. It really gets into, as we talked about, how we're going to power it, what are the applications running on it, what is the curriculum the teachers are going to use, who's going to do that training and support, and be the person on the ground long term for that, and that rolls up into a bigger price tag. And as Sylvia mentioned earlier, a lot of the failings are a lot of people not thinking through all this, or they're coming forth with, okay, I'm going to put this in hand out 2,000 of these, and this great Google donated the hardware. Well, it's going to take a lot more than $30,000 to deploy 2,000 of these in Haiti. What is the true budget to do that? And maybe the innovation is finding other funding sources and combining that with this grant, with other grants, to make a whole package. Or breaking it into pieces. The innovation may be, guess what? We'll break it into pieces and have these different granting agencies look at funding different parts of it. So we can't, but here's the whole view that we have, here's the whole idea. Here is the idea with all the specific problems that we're going to address or needs associated with it, and then pulling that whole package together. So, as you can tell from my earlier comments, as a technologist in my area of specialty, I focused on, well, I could do great things in that area, but as you can see, I was missing, I only got 2/5 of the picture right, and it was after I put a team together that could address those other areas that, the success started coming in these grant submissions. And part of what, ISIF and other granting agencies are trying to do is find innovative approaches and solutions for that. And once again, it isn't about always how cheap this is. It's about, well, is there an application that really benefits women, for example, in those local communities? Is there a support structure putting that technology there, and if they're having a problem with it, that somebody can train them? And so it isn't just about the cheap price of the equipment, it's the whole infrastructure that's wrapped around it. And those are the issues, as I mentioned, if we look specifically at ISIF, the goals of what they're trying to achieve are finding new ideas and innovation in internet access and broadband in rural communities. They're trying to find people that are doing applications on mobile phones for good, whether it's in healthcare, women's issues, education, and coming up with those innovative ideas on how to do things better. Or in general internet-related issues from society, from security, from free access, and promoting those ideas and concepts. So, here's an agency that I think would agree 100% with what you said. How do we find innovative ways to make sure no one's left behind, that we're addressing, whether it's educational needs or women's needs. And, that's the goal why we're here today is we all have ideas on how that can be done. How do we get those ideas down on paper? How do we get those in front of a granting agency so that we can take that idea, put the right identify the right things around that idea or what needs to support that idea and try some of these new things. Not everything's going to work, and some of it is research, and some of it is understanding, is that idea going to make an impact, and trying these things out. Because until we go try, nothing's going to happen. And until we can get funding to try, nothing's going to happen. I think that we all have good ideas. Now it's how do we articulate that good idea? How do we put the infrastructure or package around that idea and go and try something new? So, and it all starts with, what is the problem you're trying to solve? Why are you seeking a grant? And it's, it's always I have this idea, but then the why is the heart of it. Why is that idea going to make a difference? Why is that idea going to impact the local community? And once again, half the room here, I'll say, are the technologists. We have a lot of ideas for technology and innovation in technology, but then it's really the why is it going to make a difference? And that's the question that we really need to answer if we want to have a successful grant. It's from a technology standpoint, why is this idea going to be different for that situation? And once again, it isn't always, as we mentioned before, about the technology. It may just be how maybe the idea how we're going to improve local capacity building in ICT related area, and then okay, we've got this idea on that type of innovation, but then why is it going to make a difference? And if we can answer that question, that can help with getting to the how and the what and how we're going to do that. But we first have to answer that question why. Why is this going to make a difference? Why is this going to help the people that we've been thinking it will? mentioned, you know, the why is the heart of the reason you're seeking the grant and what you're trying to do. But you'll see from different granting organizations, you'll see them asking for it different ways. Not what is the problem you're solving. They'll say, you know, what's the problem statement? What's the description of needs? What's the needs assessment? You know, what's the problem analysis? And, you know, and so you'll see wording of different types, but it still gets back to the heart of it. You've got this idea, now why, you know, are you seeking the grant? Why do you think it's going to make a difference for that situation that you're approaching? And being able to articulate that. You know, I'm going to pick on this school that I was visiting in Chuuk. You know, here's a picture of the girls playing outside. But it was interesting, they had just 6 months earlier had a computer lab installed that they had been successful in receiving a grant. But what was interesting was they had, you know, looked only at the hardware side of it and the power side of it, but hadn't looked at the support side at all, or the training. And after 6 months, nobody was using it because of the 10 computers. They all were full of viruses and they weren't usable anymore. So while somebody had a good idea, well, if we put a computer lab in, guess what? You know, we'll improve the education of the students. But in 6 months it was not usable because they hadn't looked at the whole problem. And, you know, as we all know, anytime we introduce technology, especially Windows-based computers, there's going to be virus issues, there's going to be all types of different issues, and nobody thought through that and how to support them. And so while it was a great idea, you know, here's another example of people pointing, oh yeah, but, you know, computers and technologies, you know, here's the headmaster at the school. They don't work in schools because look, after 6 months it doesn't work anymore. So in that case, what we did was actually, you know, we reinstalled the OS and the applications and all the laptops, put in a program called Deep Freeze, and what that does is locks the OS, locks the application so that students can't change them or teachers, and if they download a virus by accident or on purpose, you just reboot the computer and it takes it right back to where it was before. And so now it really made a usable computer lab for the students and teachers. But once again, it's thinking through that whole infrastructure and all the pieces of it. Because the interesting thing here is they went back to the grantor and said, oh, it's not working, we need more money. And they said, well, sorry, you know, you should have thought of that. We don't have more money to give you. And, you know, it was a sad case of, you know, it wasn't fully thought through. So once again, it's, you know, a good idea, you know, in this case, computers in the school, and, you know, but what is the full problem? You know, what is the description of the need, and how do you address the long-term support and maintenance? And so it's you know, taking that idea that you have and building that whole package around it if you want to have a successful grant application, because the majority of grantees look at that you've thought the whole picture through, and you can articulate that. So, what we need to do is, once we figure out what our idea is, what are, how we're, or the whys of it, you know, how are we going to describe and document it? And this is really where the challenge comes in, because if you do a good idea of articulating this part of it, then it makes it very easy for the grantor, the person giving the grant, to understand what you're trying to do. So, taking that idea and really saying, well, how is that going to help the situation in our community or on the island that concerns you? Why does it matter? And, you know, look, I'll point fingers at the technical side of the table again, because, you know, that's my background. You know, a lot of times we get caught up in why this technology is so great, and miss the fact, well, why does that really matter? You know, oh, it's great you want to bring and convert everything in Vanuatu to IP version 6. Isn't that exciting? Well, okay, that may be exciting, but why does it really matter? Can you articulate, you know, the average person walking down the street, why does that matter for them? and who is affected and why is it significant? Or if it is significant and it does matter, why is that happening? What is the cause for that? So it's really taking your idea, building upon it, that idea and packaging it with, does it fit into the idea of the granting agency, and then being able to describe and document that. How is that situation going to, in the community or island, concern you? How does it really matter? Who's affected? Why is that significant? Or if it's a problem happening, why is that happening and what's the cause? And using an example I've used so far, like a computer lab in a school, what's the situation in that island community or that concerns you? If I look at small island schools, it's the fact they don't have a library in a lot of cases. They don't have access to information of the world that they textbooks. Well, guess what? Having access to the internet and a computer lab, guess what? That can address that situation. Well, why does it matter? Do the teachers really want this? Is it going to really provide the effect that we want, and how is it going to affect the students? Is it going to improve their learning abilities? Is it going to improve the teacher's ability? And why is that significant? Or why is it happening? Why isn't more, digital information coming to schools? What is the cause why that's not happening? For example, in Vanuatu, we can address why that's not happening, and then apply our idea. It gives the granting agency an idea that you thought through all of that. Why concerns what is the situation that we're trying to address? Why does it matter, or who's affected, or why it's significant? Or why is that situation happening, and how is this idea going to address that? So the problem is really focusing on who you're going to help and who's going to be affected by that. So it's really having those ideas of in the result of your idea, what is that problem really trying to focus on? Who is it affecting? What it isn't about, and the failure that I see in grant applications, where they focus, it's not about who your organization is. It's not about what your organization wants. It's really about focusing the problem on who you're going to help, and the situation that's affected by where you want to apply that help. It's so it's really moving the focus of oh, I've got this great idea and I've got the perfect firm that can do it, or a group of people, or implementation. It's less about that. It's not about why your organization is great or why your organization wants to do that. It's about who you want to help and the situation that it's going to. So we just have to keep that in mind as we're taking our idea, applying it to how the grantor, where their areas of specialties are, and then addressing all these infrastructural things around it, and then focusing on who we're helping. And just to reiterate, going back to this slide, once again, it's who are we going to help in our community, and why does it matter, and why is it significant? And focusing on that, and less about where we see failures, where people talk all about their own organization and what their organization wants to do. It's not about what you want to do, it's about who you're going to help. So what we really want to do is kind of move to the why of the idea that we have. And why does that situation concern you? As you're thinking of this idea and how it's going to help your community, your island, or your society, why is that situation concerning you? What is the passion you have behind it? And I think, what I learned from an early grant writing stage was I could do the technical side, but the passion never came out of why I wanted to do that. The passion never came out why I was concerned about a situation. In the case of the work that I was doing, it was putting computer labs in schools. And why was I passionate about that, and why I wanted to make a difference? Which really gets to the significance of why that really matters. And so, what was my passion for technology in schools, and being able to articulate why that is significant and why it matters. And then once again, if there's a situation that I don't like that I'm seeing, what is happening with that situation, be able to describe, what the current environment is, and then the vision of, that situation that we see, that how we're going to change it, or how we're going to solve what's causing that problem. So as we're writing, we have to keep these bigger ideas in mind when we do that. And so, why does that situation, concern you? It's really, we get to the question of, how do you expect that problem to change with your help and this funding you get? So, the situation that concerns me, just as I started working in Senegal, where these rural schools didn't have textbooks, schools didn't have electricity, they didn't have access to the information that we have. And looking at, just what would be possible at that school with a small computer lab and how the difference that would make. Well, I could, explain the technical side of all of that, but my passion never came up, which was, how do I expect what I'm going to do change that situation, and how that's, with this funding and the help I get from an agency, how am I going to change that? And it's really, capturing that passion for that idea and how that idea is going to help, that's critical as you write these grant applications. Having the granting association see that you care about that topic, you care about those issues, and that you really want to make a difference. And what will be achieved? What do you want to achieve with that wanted outcome? In my case in Senegal, what I wasn't able to articulate to continue to do school projects there was that I was trying to put pilots in place to show what's possible, and to show the government, to show the telecom, to show the Ministry of Education what could be possible in these rural schools, because most of them had, back to my, how I got into this with the CEO from the Vanuatu phone company who viewed secondary school or primary schools, you can never do anything there because there's no power. And the same thing in Senegal, there's no power at those rural schools, there's no telecom, we can't, they're not even on our map to do anything with. And, my goal was, well, can I actually put a pilot in place that's significant enough to change their minds? That, and my desired outcome was to raise the bar and have them think differently about what could be done with rural primary schools. But I couldn't articulate that. I could talk about I know how to select great hardware, how to deal with the power issue with those rural schools, but those rural schools weren't on their radar map because I couldn't articulate the passion of wanting to do a pilot to show them what could be done different than the norm. So, what we want to do is to write this problem statement and how we're going to solve it, and what that means to the project we want to do. And it isn't about why your organization needs that money. It's like, okay, I want to put a computer lab, I know how to do the power, now I need $50,000 and I can do that. Well, that's not what it's about. And it's also it's also not about what you want to do with the project. Like, I got this great idea for software, and if you give me this much money, I can, everybody on the island will, benefit. Well, and my company will benefit. Well, that doesn't really tell me what that's going to do, or who it's going to help, or what problem it's going to solve. So we really need to look at it a little bit differently, which is focusing that problem on what we're trying to solve, and then tie that back to what the granting organization wants to do. So in the case of the ISIF, you know, here's the 3 things that they're trying to do with their grant money. One is innovation on access provisioning. The second, we talked about code for good, for common good. And the third is rights from a strategic use of the internet. So, oh, did I forget one?
Innovation on learning and localization. And it's about languages and capacity building on language conservation, localization of training materials, and innovative ways of promoting learning through technology on different issues.
We got our idea, we need to put the package around it on who we're going to help, or what's the situation of what we're trying to fix, who we're going to help, and how it's going to, how we're going to approach it. And then looking at, well, with this specific organization, ISIF, here are the key things that they're looking for that addresses. If our problem doesn't fit in any of these categories, we may want to look elsewhere. If it's ICT driven, we see how is it going to fit in one of these areas, and then as we write our ideas, understanding these allows us to formulate our thoughts and put our whole package together. So what I'd like to do for the next 30 minutes is actually, I know all of you have ideas, take what we've talked about this morning so far, and in the next 30 minutes, look at these key things that from ISIF and see how you can package your ideas around that. It's hard to be creative on the spot. It's okay, you have 30 minutes to get this done. Take that idea you have and articulate it. It's not an easy thing to do. And sometimes we don't always end up where we think we're going to go when we start with that idea. And as we start looking at what our grant, our funding agencies' requirements are and areas they want to focus, it kind of takes us in a different direction. And I know this little story, it's a little off tangent, but it kind of shows we don't always end up where we think we're going to end up. I was visiting last August the University of Guam. We did a workshop there on low-cost telecommunication networks for developing regions. And held a workshop with about 20 participants. And it was interesting because we did the workshop, and when we were done, we got a tour of the ICT facilities of the campus. And there's a gentleman there that who's a professor, and he runs all the IT infrastructure for the whole university. He's quite proud of his data center. He's quite proud of this big computer lab that he has that any students can come in and use. And it was actually about a room this big with tables going the other direction, full of computers, and it was full of students. And he said, yeah, students can come here, they get really great bandwidth so they can get their research done, they can whatever assignments they want. He goes, but I'm blocking them all from using social media because that just distracts them. And as I looked over his shoulder, about 90% of the screens were on Facebook. And so he thought he had that all under control. And then the other person in our party said, but they're all using Facebook. And he goes, no, they're not. No, they're not. He was denying the obvious of what was occurring, but the students had figured a way to get around with proxying to get to where the sites they wanted to get to. So, and it's the same with this. We don't always know where we're going to end up. And a gentleman running the ICT at the University of Guam, he thinks he's gotten to a point, but he doesn't want to accept the reality of what's really happening around him. And I think that's key as we're writing these statements. We have to accept the reality that's around us. While we have this great idea, and it's easy to think, well, if people would just do it this way, this would be successful. Well, the reality of the situation is, of course, people are people, and they're going to do what they want to do. But how can we work with them and do something different? So So as we look at these problem statements, of course, as I was talking, we have this idea, we know what the funding agency wants, the areas of theirs. Now, the next step of what we were trying to do with this exercise is establish, a framework around that we can build. From this idea, what would the project goals be? What would our objectives and methods be? And how would we actually evaluate them? Because of course, as a funding agency, they want to report to know, how did things happen? Did they go well? How many teachers were trained on ICT, or how did we improve the local language skills, putting ICT into early childhood reading development, for example? Or are we trying to solve an internet traffic congestion problem by putting in an internet exchange point? And how did that improve the local traffic on the island? So we always have to keep in mind not only the idea and how we're going to implement it into goals, but then how do we actually measure it? And so so that's critical. So it's really what we're trying to do is provide a thorough explanation of the needs, our test assumptions, and also anticipate the questions, as we read these. And one of the things that I've learned is, and I'll call it the mother test, is, if I can explain what my grant is to my mother, who's not an ICT professional, and who's 75 years old, and she can say, I really don't get that. Well, sometimes the granting agency's not going to get it either. And if you can put it into terms that a person not associated with it at all can understand, then we have a better chance of succeeding. And then we want to incorporate, those into proposal guidelines. But once again, it starts with this framing statement. What is the problem we're solving? And then building our detail around it. My personal experience is I'm working on this project in Ethiopia, and what it's trying to do is improve early childhood reading. The problem they're having in Ethiopia is 50% of the first graders drop out of school and never go back to school ever again. And when you think that's half of the population of the country is dropping out of the first grade, that's a lot of people. So one of the things they're trying to do is improve early childhood reading as a way to keep those children in school and engaged. But I'm facing the same challenge as the one coming in as the ICT expert, and how can that help with early childhood reading? With language experts, like, no, computers aren't going to help them. Well, no, we're trying to think out of the box a little bit. Is there a place that it can help? Or is it further up the food chain? Is there ways to improve the way teachers are being taught on how to do early childhood reading? So I agree with you, sometimes it's a disruptive path with the current things that have been in place a long time, but it's also then looking at how can it, looking at the whole picture and how